It's slightly after noon. We need to reward those who are with us on time by starting promptly after giving a little bit of option for latecomers. Gives me great pleasure today to welcome back to Michigan State, in at least electronic way, Professor Louis Siegelbaum. Louis is the Jack and Margaret Sweet Professor Emeritus of History. I mentioned Emeritus clearly there because he's no longer with us living in California, but through the miracle of Zoom presentations, we can have him with us today. His talk today is Bumping Up Against Ukraine as an Historian of Russia. And I think he'll make some mention, not only describing what he's going to do, but also of his memoir, which is connected with this talk, Stuck on Communism, Memoir of a Russian Historian, Northern Illinois University Press, 2019, which I happen to have a copy of here, and I didn't get you to sign it before you scooted to the West Coast. I guess I'll have to come out and visit you. Any case, please welcome Professor Siegelbaum and get ready for, I think, some interesting comments of his life as a historian and probably as it's relevant to Ukraine.
Right, okay, let's see what we do here. So how do I get to the, oh, okay.
Down at the bottom, there's a share screen.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good. Okay. Thank you, Norm, for that introduction and for having invited me to give this talk. I also want to thank Mary Firdousi for the publicity, arranging the publicity and the logistics for the talk. And I want to thank everyone who is tuning in or attending or whatever the appropriate verb is. So the title of my talk, Bumping Up Against Ukraine as an Historian of Russia, contains a bit of a teaser. I'm going to talk about Ukraine, but not as a specialist on that country's history. The history department at MSU does have such a person, my erstwhile colleague, Matt Pauley. By bumping up against Ukraine, I mean, and this had only occurred to me in the relative tranquility of my retirement, that much of the research I've done, not by conscious design, was primarily situated in Ukraine. So I thought I would explore with you why this was so, and why, nonetheless, throughout my career, I referred to myself as a Russian historian, or an historian of Russia. So for starters, there are two reasons I can think of. The first is laziness. I mean this in two senses. When I got into this business back in the 1970s, it was commonplace to refer to the Soviet Union as Russia. As if the other 14 republics, including Ukraine, didn't exist. Nobody, to my satisfaction, has ever explained this gross inaccuracy. My hunch is that it was partly a legacy of American non-recognition of the USSR that lasted until 1933. For decades thereafter, and especially during the Cold War, the notion that Russia had captured other nations and that the political division of the country into 15 union republics was a fig leaf covering rule from Moscow perpetuated popular usage of the Russians. Let me take as an example something I chose more or less at random from the paper of record, the New York Times. This from April 5th, 1981. In the midst of the civil unrest in Poland, over the rise and suppression of the free trade union movement, Solidarność. Page 3 contained a report from the Times International Military Affairs correspondent, Drew Middleton. The headline of Middleton's article read, quote, "Russians in Poland, signs of alertness." And the first line of the article read, "The methodical assembly of munitions, equipment, and food in Poland by the Soviet army has created a military structure for any Russian action there." Even after such terms as man or mankind long ceased to be stand-ins for men and women or humanity, Russians continued to be used to mean all Soviet citizens. So I stand guilty of using Russian in this way, not because I was a Cold Warrior, you should understand, but out of capitulation to the dominant discourse, or laziness. The other way in which I was lazy is that the only language I mastered for research purposes, other than the French I learned in school, was Russian. As the lingua franca of the Soviet Union, Russian made sense. The vast majority of documents one would be likely to see in Soviet archives were in that language. But still, having acquired Russian, how hard would it have been for me to pick up another Eastern Slavic language, say Ukrainian? The second reason for referring to myself as a Russian historian, rather than say a Soviet historian, is also partly linguistic, but in a very different sense. Russian is or can be more capacious than Soviet in two ways. The first is chronological. It can refer to the Russian Empire, Российская империя. The history of that place, that is to say, from its formalization in the early 18th century, right up until the revolution of 1917. And then after the Soviet Union's disintegration in 1991, Российская Федерация, the Russian Federation. Because in Russian, the word for Russian can be either the ethnonym, Ruski or Ruskaya, Ruskoye, depending on gender, or the civic or political expanse of that territory, Российская, Российsk. So that territory ruled from Moscow, or in the imperial period, St. Petersburg. So when I referred to myself as a Russian historian, I meant an historian of these three political entities: the Russian Empire, which included present-day Ukraine, the USSR, within which Russia and Ukraine were two of those 15 Union republics, and the present-day Russian Federation, which encompasses how many? 83 or 85 so-called federal republics, but most definitively not Ukraine. So in this context, the fact that much of my scholarly career has been devoted to subjects based in Ukraine is remarkable, I think, and indicative of Ukraine's importance to some of the themes of Russian, 17 Imperial Rossiyskaya, history, and the history of the Soviet Union that engaged me. Let me begin by mentioning three such themes. First, it's only fair that after engaging in some linguistic analysis about Russian, I should mention the etymology of Ukraine. The word derives from borderland or frontier. Oh, I'm not showing the slides, Leslie tells me. Why is that the case?
That's not, it's true, because it may be just my computer.
Oh, are you seeing the slides?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Oh, my goodness. Why is that?
Let's see.
Oh dear, just a moment. Technical difficulties. So we want to escape.
That never happens to us.
Let's go back.
Our
Okay.
whole university internet went down yesterday.
Oh dear. Okay, what are we doing here? Remove spotlight. Screen share, isn't that it?
Yes, that's right. Share screen.
Okay,
Okay, and now what?
click on this wherever you see the slides.
I don't see the slides. That's the problem.
Uh-huh.
Desktop.
Make sure your PowerPoint's in slideshow and then pick that square.
Bring up the slideshow. Okay.
Now, slideshow. There it is. Slideshow. PowerPoint. That seems to be on it.
If you click on show the slideshow, start show.
Play from stop.
Yes.
Now? No slides?
Still no slides.
Oh dear.
I would make sure that you have your PowerPoint slide open and then you hit on share screen and then you will see all of your open tabs and you should see your PowerPoint slide as one of the tabs.
If you clicked on share screen before putting your PowerPoint in slideshow, you have to get out of share screen and go back in so that it can see that window,
Now
I think.
go back into share screen. Okay.
I think.
There we
Yeah. All right. Well, I will give you a, I'm very sorry about
Hit
that.
now.
Yes.
All right, all right. Yes, now?
We've all been through this, Louis. It's not unusual.
Okay, so that's there's Ukraine. I guess I'll put that. And there's the New York Times article, meanings of Russian in Russian, the Russian Federation, and here we are. All right. So the three themes that have engaged me that involve Ukraine. First, the word Ukraine derives etymologically from borderland or frontier territory. But whose borderlands? Whose edge? Historically, the lands between Muscovite and Polish domains. From the 17th century onward, Ukraine was the site of much toing and froing of empires, Muscovite, Tsarist, and Soviet, Polish-Lithuanian, Austro-Hungarian, and Nazi. It was the site of divided loyalties and senses of belonging, belonging both to lands to the east and lands to the west. In this sense, Ukraine is, or can be, at the center of meanings and limits of empire. Secondly, by the same token, Ukraine is also particularly fruitful for the study of national identity formation. How Ukrainians have identified themselves vis-a-vis their neighbors across borders and within Ukraine is a complex and fascinating subject. How is it possible, as Faith Hillis argued in her book from 2013, for modern Russian nationalism to have arisen in the late 19th century among right bank of the Dnieper River Ukrainian intellectuals? Exactly where, a century later, Ukrainian nationalism would be at its most fervent. This has everything to do with Little Russians distinguishing themselves from non-Orthodox Polish nobles and Yiddish-speaking Jews, among others. Finally, in terms of economic and social history, Ukraine's coastline along the Black Sea gave it tremendous commercial potential. Potential that was realized with the development in the 19th century of Odessa as a major cosmopolitan port city. And in the case of of Crimea, a center of viticulture and tourism. Meanwhile, the rich deposits of coal and iron ore in Ukraine's Donetsk basin, or Donbass, were attracting Belgian, French, and British capital, leading to the formation of a rough and ready industrial working class. In the 1930s, the region would be further developed, becoming a major site of Stalin's Industrial Revolution. So to repeat, in the course of my career, I wrote about some of these places and themes not as a specialist on Ukraine, but because what was going on in Ukraine fascinated me. But enough about me. Let me tell you about Tatiana Samofalova. I first met Tatiana in 1989 in the eastern Ukrainian city of Donetsk. In the summer of 1992, I returned for a third time to that city. When we met again, I asked her what it meant to live in a country that had declared its independence from the Soviet Union in December 1991, some 6 months earlier. Here is her reply. I was born in Ukraine, and I've lived here all my life. My father, my husband's father, my grandparents are buried here. I believe that no one will expel me from Ukraine. I've been converted into a Ukrainian to such an extent that it's no problem for me to speak Ukrainian, though very few Russians do it. Even Ukrainians themselves forgot how to speak Ukrainian. It's not enough to live in independent Ukraine. My relatives, my aunt, my cousin, they live in Russia, and it's become a problem to go and see them. We cannot meet with each other very often, and letters don't get delivered. Why should I want such independence? What am I independent from? A little translation might be necessary here. Tatiana speaks of having been converted into a Ukrainian because, like many residents of the Donbass, she had stronger linguistic and even familial ties with Russians, and her primary civic identity had been Soviet. At that time, I remember thinking how naive of Tatiana to speak about matters of high politics in terms of her relatives across the border. Tatiana was the wife of Valery Samofalov. I had met them in the summer of 1989, owing to my participation in an oral history video project formed on the basis of a sister city relationship between the former coal and steel town of Pittsburgh and Donetsk. Valery had emerged as the leader of the spontaneously formed strike committees at one of Donetsk's 24 coal mines. A 40-something grandfather at the time, Valery exuded confidence and optimism as he and other strike leaders from the Donbass and other coal mining regions throughout the Soviet Union pressed their demands on Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev. The strikers actually won greater autonomy for Moscow and some other demands, but their victory proved short-lived as the disintegration of the entire Soviet economy accelerated. In the meantime, I had participated in the making of an hour-long documentary called Perestroika from Below. I also co-authored with the director of that documentary, Danny Wolkowitz, several articles published in The Nation and a book about the miners' movement across the collapse of the Soviet Union and the emergence of independent Ukraine. Little did I expect that I would have occasion to quote Tatiana again, but in the summer of 2014, as the eastern Ukrainian provinces of Donetsk and Luhansk declared themselves people's republics after the ousting of Ukraine's president in the so-called Maidan Revolution, war broke out between the Ukrainian army and irregulars from the Donbass, backed by the neighboring Russian Federation. Amidst the flurry of articles I read at the time about the war, one in the New York Times alarmed me most. It reported on civilian casualties from the Kuibyshev district of Donetsk, the very same neighborhood where we had spent so much time in 1989, 91, and 92. Valentina Surmai, a 72-year-old pensioner. Alla Vasyutina, a 60-year-old cook. I held my breath as I read on, hoping I would not encounter Tatiana's name. And I didn't. But I did recall her words. Why should I want such independence? And what am I independent from? Words that seemed far wiser than they had more than 2 decades earlier. But why had I been asked to join this oral history project in the first place? The year before the video team had descended on Donetsk, I published a book on the Stakhanovites, that collection of super productive Soviet workers in the 1930s, named after this guy, Alexei Stakhanov. Stakhanov, who hailed from central Russia, migrated to the Ukrainian Donbass as a young man for the same reason most labor migrants pick up stakes. He needed a better job. He found one at the Central Irmino mine, where on the night of August 31st, 1935, with special assistance of a whole team of fellow miners and party personnel, he dug 102 tons of coal, 14 times his quota. For a few years, the whole country seemed consumed by production records, with one after another breathlessly reported in the Soviet press as if they were sporting events. I wrote a whole book about this stuff because I was curious to know if it was all pokazucha, empty spectacle, and if not, what might have motivated workers to participate in it. The Central Irmino mine, where Stakhanov set his record, was adjacent to the town of Kadievka in the Luhansk region of the Donbass. When Stakhanov died in 1978, after having led a debauched alcoholic existence for several decades, the town was renamed in his honor as Stakhanov, circled in red here on the map. But fast forward to May 2016, in the midst of the war in Ukraine's eastern provinces, the Ukrainian parliament sought to, or perhaps de-Sovietize, place names by decreeing that Stakhanov, then a town of about 75,000 people, should revert to its original name of Kadievka. But since it remains under the control of the Luhansk People's Republic, the decree has remained null and void. Looking back, as I did a few years ago while writing my memoir, I was astonished to realize that during the period when I was involved with the miners of Donetsk, I was also operating on another track that also led me to Ukraine. In 1990, I accompanied this man, Raoul Hilberg, an Austrian-born a political historian, while widely regarded during his lifetime as the preeminent scholar of the final solution, to Kharkiv, Ukraine's second city. We were part of a research team organized by the US Holocaust Memorial Museum to identify materials in Soviet archives pertaining to the Holocaust. My biggest find in the Kharkiv archive was a color-coded list of residents by street and building, alphabetically arranged on the basis of a census conducted by local authorities in December 1941, with the names of Jews on yellow pages and those of Russians, Ukrainians, Poles, and Germans on white ones. The occupying authorities used these lists to assemble the city's Jewish population, some 10,000 people, transport them to the grounds of the tractor factory, where units from Einsatzgruppe C proceeded to execute them. How many other Jews from Ukraine suffered the same fate? I don't have the figures. Let's just say many. For the moment, I want to dwell on other associations one can make as an historian of Russia between Ukrainians and Jews. Let me start from the present and work back. Among the many remarkable things about the election of Volodymyr Zelensky as president of Ukraine in April 2019 is that he is Jewish. Well, let me rephrase that. Among the many remarkable things about Zelensky is how little the fact that he is Jewish seems to matter. Zelensky was born in 1978 in eastern Ukraine. His father was a computer scientist, his mother an engineer. His paternal grandfather fought in the Red Army during World War II, or as it's still known in Russia, the Great Patriotic War. And his great-grandfather and 3 of his father's brothers were victims of the Holocaust. Yuri Slyozkin's The Jewish Century argues that Jews from the so-called Pale of Settlement, this demarcated territory, the part of the Russian Empire to which Jews had been confined from the time of the partitions of Poland in the late 18th century, that Jews from this area underwent 3 migrations beginning in the late 19th century. 2 of them we are very familiar with, to the United States and other countries in the Americas, as well as various European countries, and to Palestine. Slyozkin wanted to draw attention to a 3rd stream, the one born of the October Revolution. He gives some data. In 1912, I'm quoting, the Jewish population of Moscow was about 15,000, or less than 1% of the total. By 1939, Moscow's Jewish population had reached 250,000, about 6% of the total, and the 2nd largest ethnic group of the city. In Leningrad, the number of Jews grew from 35,000 in 1912 to 84,600 in 1926, and 201,542 in 1939. In Kharkiv, from 11,000 to 81,000 and 130,000. And finally, Kiev, in the old Pale of Settlement, from 32,000 to 140,000, and then 224,000. On the eve of World War II, 1.3 million Jews were living in areas that had been closed to them a quarter of a century earlier. First-generation immigrants in their places of residence outside the former Pale. Snowskin's point is that by overlooking this migration stream, we fail to appreciate that for the first generation of Soviet Jews, those who came of age after 1917, the revolution meant the fulfillment of their dreams for emancipation. Emancipation from the Pale to which they had been confined under the Tsars, from the shtetls that dotted the landscape of the Pale, from the limitations on what professions they could pursue, and from what many regarded as the suffocating religiosity of their parents, indeed, from Judaism itself. This is the generation of Isaac Babel, the master short story writer from Odessa, who rode with the Red Cavalry, the Red Cossack Cavalry, during the war with Poland in 1920. It's the generation of the great novelist and World War II correspondent Vasily Grossman, who hailed from Berdichev, Ukraine, and of others who filled Soviet literary journals with their stories, and Soviet bureaucracies, among them the OGPU NKVD, the secret police, with their enthusiastic participation. Aside from the Donbass, Crimea, as you know, has been at loggerheads between the Ukrainian and Russian governments. This is because in February 2014, days after the Maidan rebellion had forced Ukrainian President Yanukovych to flee to Russia, Russian forces, dubbed Little Green Men by Ukrainians, seized control of the entire peninsula. A referendum held on March 16 produced an overwhelming majority in favor of Russian annexation. Many countries, including the United States, condemned the annexation as the grossest violation of territorial integrity in Europe since the end of the Second World War. The Russian government spoke of self-determination by Crimea's population. Did the Russians have a point? As of 2001, roughly 60% of the population identified as ethnically Russian, a quarter as Ukrainian, and about 12% as Crimean Tatar. Most Russians and Ukrainians descended from settlers who arrived after the deportation in 1944 of virtually all Crimean Tatars into the Soviet interior, primarily Uzbekistan. This as punishment for their ostensible collaboration with the Nazi invaders. I'm not suggesting here that ethnicity is destiny, but rather that for many Russians, the annexation in 2014 represented a return to the status quo ante, a return to a Russian, Rossiyskoye, and maybe even Russkoye state. Then again, how significant was it that from the formation of the Crimean Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic in 1921 until 1954, Crimea had belonged to the Russian Soviet Federated Socialist Republic. As Tatiana Samofalova had implied, internal so-called national boundaries within the Soviet Union didn't matter that much. Perhaps the boundary between Russia and Ukraine, least of all. Indeed, for many Russians and Ukrainians, national identity didn't seem that big a deal either. I'll note here that future Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev indicated Ukrainian as his national identity in some documents, such as those for 1942 and 47, but Russian for one from 1945. This is the one from 1947. And this is the one for, this is Ruski, 1945. So little did it seem to matter that in 1954, Nikita Khrushchev simply transferred Crimea from Russian to Ukrainian sovereignty. Khrushchev himself had been born in the central Russian province of Kursk, but migrated as a 14-year-old boy to Donetsk in 1908. He spent the next 21 years in Ukraine before transferring to Moscow. Many have speculated about why he decided to give Crimea to Ukraine. I'm going to read to you an excerpt from an entry on the website 17 Moments in Soviet History. The entry, written in the year 2000, is called The Gift of Crimea. Quote, on February 27, 1954, Pravda published a short announcement on its front page that the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR had decreed on February 19 the transfer of the Crimean Oblast from the RSFSR to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. The decree, which ran a mere 8 lines, stated that this measure was being taken because of the economic commonalities, territorial closeness, and communication and cultural links between Crimea and Ukraine. But why was this done? Was it, as was described at the time and for decades thereafter, a gift to Ukraine? If so, what motivated such generosity? Whatever the reasons, and more recent research points to Politburo politics as Khrushchev tried to build up his coterie of supporters, a gift that at the time was essentially meaningless has acquired great historical importance. I wrote that entry when I was constructing 17 Moments in Soviet History, the website, with Jim von Gilden of Macalester College. Funny enough, I think it was the first among 100 or so that I wrote. I chose to write it, ironically, as an experiment to see if we could construct a unit for the year 1954, one of the 17 so-called moments, around an event of little consequence. Little could I have suspected then that 14 years later, the website would be one of the few sites for information about Crimea when the gift was forcibly nullified. On February 27, 2014, NPR interviewed me along with Khrushchev's great-granddaughter, Nina, a professor in international affairs at the New School in New York, for a program about the Russian seizure of the peninsula. Trending data showed that for March, the gift of Crimea had over 50,000 visitors. Two of my grandparents hailed from what would become Ukraine. Louis Siegelbaum, my father's father, was born in Odessa in 1879, the same year, incidentally, as another Jewish son of the future Ukraine, Trotsky. Louis emigrated to New York as a young man during the wave of Eastern European Jewish migration to the Americas just before the turn of the century. Sadie Rubel, my mother's mother, came to the United States from this town, Kolomea, or in Ukrainian, Kolomia, located in the Western Ukrainian region of Ivano-Frankivsk. When my grandma Sadie lived there, Kolomia was still part of the Kingdom of Galicia within the Austro-Hungarian Empire since 1848 by the Emperor Franz Joseph. My great-grandparents had owned some kind of fruit store in Kolomia, which according to family legend was once visited by the Empress Zita. This was the Zita who had married Karl Franz Joseph in 1911 and who, upon the assassination of Karl Franz Joseph's uncle, Franz Ferdinand in 1914, became the consort to the heir apparent. And in 1916, with the death of Franz Joseph, Karl and Zita had assumed the titles of emperor and empress, albeit briefly. By this time, Kolomia had much of the rest of what is today Western Ukraine had gone back and forth between Imperial Russian and Austro-Hungarian armies. My grandmother Sadie had left for the United States along with her parents and several siblings just before the war. But the remainder of the family, Sadie's younger sister Adele, and 5 even younger siblings, were stuck. For 5 years, Adele protected her brothers and sisters from what she referred to as the Cossacks. Only in 1919 were they reunited with the rest of the family in New York. Kolomia, meanwhile, had become part of newly independent Poland and remained so until 1939, when the Soviet Union annexed it and the rest of Western Ukraine. In 1941, it became part of Nazi-occupied Europe. So only in 1945, notwithstanding resistance from the Ukrainian insurgent army that continued into the 1950s, did this region adhere to the rest of the Soviet Union. That resistance was at its most fierce and effective in the Carpathian Mountains along Ukraine's western border with Hungary and Slovakia. And it's there in bucolic Transcarpathia that I'd like to end this excursion, as it were, through Soviet Ukraine. I've never been to this part of the country, but I traveled there vicariously about 2 years ago, when, as an external member of a doctoral committee, I read a remarkable dissertation by a daughter of Ukraine. Katerina Burkush defended her dissertation in March 2019 at the European University Institute in Florence. Katerina, or Katya, was raised in Kiev, but spent her summers in the Transcarpathian village where her father had been born. There, as she writes in her introduction, she was, quote, both an insider and an outsider in the community. As a blood relative, I experienced a deeper sense of inclusion than, for instance, my mother. But the status of an insider came with heavy responsibilities. Labor, in the form of harvesting, haymaking, and other agricultural chores, was certainly one of the main requirements. Labor and belonging were intertwined through the idea of care for the common household, from which everyone benefited and to which everyone had to contribute. Pitching in was a familial prerequisite. This sense of duty and belonging summoned back not only Katya's father and Katya herself, but thousands of seasonal workers whose only true home was in Transcarpathia. Although she didn't know it at the time, Katya was already collecting data for her dissertation when she visited her father's relatives in the mountains. Her subject would be male seasonal migrants who every year throughout the 1960s, 70s, and 80s spent months away from home, traveling to the far reaches of the Soviet Union, to Siberia and Kazakhstan, to the Russian interior and its far north. There they laid pipelines, cut timber, and constructed barns and other buildings for collective farms. They earned good money, enough to upgrade their dwellings back home with extra rooms and add electricity and other modern conveniences. With perhaps a nod to Quentin Tarantino, Katya called her dissertation Inglorious Heroes of Labor. Inglorious because the informal arrangements they made with collective farm directors and other officials were at best semi-legal and at worst gross violations of Soviet labor laws. Heroes, not only because they worked far more intensively and put in longer hours than locals, but also because aside from boosting their household's income, they made a significant contribution to the functionality of the Soviet planned economy. These seasonal migrants traveled so extensively within the Soviet Union because they couldn't get permission to travel abroad, but crossing internal boundaries within the country was no problem. These days, according to Katya, they work in Portugal, Spain, and other EU countries, as well as in Russia, although during the pandemic, I'm not so sure. I was fortunate enough to serve as an examiner for Katya's dissertation because some 15 years ago, I took up the study of migration within Russian imperial and Soviet boundaries with Leslie Page Mock, a famous historian of European migration that some of you know well. We published a book whose framework of repertoires and regimes of migration Katya applied to her seasonal migrants. I'm going to finish on a wistful note. Katya Borkush, it seems to me, could only have written the kind of dissertation she did because of her biography, a daughter of Ukraine who had a familial connection to the subject of her dissertation, but who also, having received a good education, pursued her graduate studies in a European university where English was the common language. Her healthy curiosity about her Transcarpathian relatives, her grandparents' lives in Soviet times, led her to her dissertation subject. Many historians, and probably other scholars of the humanities, whether they're conscious of it or not, choose what to study because of some personal or biographical connection. I spend quite a bit of space in my memoir arguing that my family's Eastern European origins did not determine my course of study. But maybe I was wrong. Whatever the case, and to repeat what I said at the outset, although I did not set out to study Katya's country, I'm glad that by virtue of my fascination with all things Soviet, communism, labor history, Jewish history, national identity, and the history of migration, I kept on bumping up against Ukraine. Now I am going to stop sharing. Okay. Thank you very much. I am certainly willing and indeed even eager to take comments or questions from you. Those of you who have stuck out this more than 1 hour. I guess if I look at, let's see, how can I see the gallery? Yes, I will. Please, what shall you do? Raise your hand if you wish to ask a question or make a comment, and I will call on you. And of course, it's always difficult to get underway, but I'm hoping someone will have something to say. So go for it.
Yeah, Lewis, it's Mark. So a couple things. One, I mean, just awesome, and I hope we taped this because I would love to show it to my 338, which is my Russian history course here, students. And if
Norm, Graham, and Mary have assured me that it has been taped.
Okay, awesome.
Perhaps the 5 minutes where we were fiddling with.
We'll edit that out. but in trying to thinking about how would I preface this for them, and I guess what I would do is say, in examining this, you looked at the fluidity of national identity and the fluidity of borders and the fluidity of economics, and then suddenly and the irrelevance in some ways of national identity, and that at the same time, yet at other times it's contested. And yet it boils down to this brutally simple binary choice in the current period. And there's almost this sort of splitting the atom explosiveness to it is how I see it, in the sense that this extreme complex history just is forced into this pattern that it doesn't fit. Is that a fair way of looking at it?
Mark, I would say not only is that a fair way of looking at it, it's a really very brilliant summary of what I was trying to do, which I almost wish I had you record and I could plagiarize from you.
Feel free, by the way.
But yeah, I mean, to briefly rehearse the sort of historiography of of all this, when we got into Soviet history, we of my generation, the only ones who were commenting on and writing about national identity within the Soviet Union tended to be people who had emigrated from the Soviet Union and were sort of shouting to the rafters about the oppression of their particular nations. And they did not have that large an audience. So it really only was in the second half of the 80s. My dear friend Ron Sunni had a great deal to do with calling attention to the complicated history of national identity in the former Soviet territories, that this became salient. And the rest of us have been, well, for a while at least, we're playing catch up and trying to integrate this into the kinds of histories that we wrote. And I can remember 1989 already in Donetsk, how we were, getting news from what was going on in Western Ukraine with the formation of Ruch, this nationalist movement, and sort of scratching our heads about, how significant this might be. Could this possibly overtake the movement that we were in the midst of trying to study and make sense of? And of course it did. And as you say, binary oppositions tended to dominate. But what I have been trying to do ever since has been to complicate, in the best sense of the word, the relationships that sort of overlay the peoples and their activities in that part of the former Soviet Union. Any other comments or questions? Speak up, because I may not see you or hear or be able to recognize.
Louis?
Yes, Steve Stone.
Well, I'll ask if nobody else who actually knows things will ask. I missed some of your early part of the talk because of technical difficulties, but you left with a very intriguing question that you didn't answer. So I'd like to hear a succinct answer from you. Maybe you were wrong. You said that personal and biographical considerations or factors or intimations did not play a role. And we can all tie our own knot, but I'd like to hear the knot you would tie. How do you think you might have been wrong, and sort of, so what?
In the memoir, Steve, as you know very well, I emphasized the heritage, as it were, of my father's membership in the American Communist Party and the consequences that had for him, which I was exposed to as a very young boy, and downplayed the Eastern European Jewish heritage of, for the most part, my mother's family, because my father's father died before I was born. Relatives, his siblings rarely talked about their birthplace. Since then, I'm saying in the last 2 or 3 years, I have come to appreciate the tug, the emotional tie, call it what you will, of my mother's family. So I want to say that, I'm, simply put, I'm the combination of the two. So it's both, I guess, in that sense. Well, thank you.
Yeah, that's a good answer. Thanks.
I want to recognize Katya Burkush as having tuned in, which is wonderful. Thank you, Katya.
Hello, Lewis.
Hello, Katya.
Thank you for mentioning my work.
Yes, but of course, we have never met.
Yeah,
in
and
person.
but I guess while listening to your presentation, I was having an almost different kind of impulse, because in my work, which is very localized, I try to get out of the region and get out of Ukraine and draw a map as wide as possible and invite all the other directions and territories in the Soviet Union, where basically the routes of the migrants that I followed, they allowed me to draw a very big map that I tried to push myself out of this small borderland that was the focus of my research. And I'm still trying to make this, to follow problems and not to try to confine myself in the territory.
And I was going pretty much in the opposite direction.
It seems so, yeah.
To Ukraine. Right. Katya is coming to us from Bucharest, am I correct, Katya?
Well, no, I used to be there, but now I'm on research mission in Transcarpathia.
I see, oh, okay. Not in your native village?
No,
Okay,
not in the village, in the central city.
I see. Well, nice to have you.
So maybe I can jump in there with a quick question that's maybe more contemporary and political. And since I'm an international relations professor, maybe I can draw you out on this a little bit. So do you think the status of Crimea is settled, essentially, or what do you see for the future from your
Oh, Norm.
California?
I don't feel very confident about predicting much in the way of not only relations between Russia and Ukraine, but you know, the future of either state. I would like to think that some form of joint citizenship or cohabitation or whatever euphemism they can come up with for shared space is possible, but I think that's probably unlikely. And I think that the fait accompli is the most likely outcome. And that, of course, bars external intervention, which, God forbid, should happen.
And what about the Donbass?
Yeah, there I think, although I confess I'm not really up to date on the latest, I think it's more likely that with a less hostile regime in Kiev, arrangements will be made for the reintegration of those two parts of those two provinces into Ukraine. I think that's maybe not too many years far off.
Okay. So you have a question from Getty?
Oh, Arch, go for it.
Hi, Louis. Thanks for a great talk. I don't have my video on because for those of us in Los Angeles, an hour ago was pretty early and I was still in my pajamas. I'd also like to unfairly ask you to predict a little bit about the future. It seems to me that the altogether advanced, sophisticated notion of ethnicity and nationality you presented is pretty much on the decline these days, that those on the other side of the fence who believe that ethnicity and nationality are primordial, that they are unchanging, that they are not attributed or learned, the tide seems to be going the other way, not only in Ukraine and Russia, but here. So I would like to sort of put you on the spot and ask you basically, is there any hope?
Is there any hope for what?
For a sophisticated, normal, non-violent kind of relation between ethnicities and nationalities?
Yeah, I not only do I like to think so, but I actually do think so. I mean, I think you know, the greater mobility that has occurred because of, you know, the transnational nature of migration and capitalism that to a large extent drives it, produced and has continued to produce a reaction, you know, a tendency driven by emotion as much as anything else to draw lines, to stake claims. And I think the destructiveness of that has in itself produced a much more healthy reaction. And hopefully, including in this country, those lines can not be erased, but be crossed much more easily and with much more amicability. If I'm too vague, I'm sorry, but that's about all I can come up with at the moment.
Well, it's hard not to be vague about the future, but again, to take a kind of a counterpoint, in Ukraine and in Russia, the more capitalist they've become, the more mobile they have become, the worse it's become.
Yeah.
Look at the Caucasus, look at Armenia, look at Ukraine. You can look all over the place, and you know, the more, in quotes, modern they become, the more backward they act.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I don't disagree. And in, you know, my more somber, sober moments, that's certainly how I feel. But I think we need to not only grasp at straws, we need to grasp at our better inclinations and do what each of us can to promote, you know, less of that kind of, as you put it so well, backwardness.
Good thought, thank you.
Hi, Louis.
Go ahead.
I'll jump in here. Thanks for the talk. I'm actually in my kitchen because I was making dinner while you were talking. So these are some of the advantages of Zoom talks. Also wanted to briefly mention that I made the exact same error that you made on Zoom on my first day of post-pandemic class, and then also in my first day of fall classes. So perhaps it was nice that you didn't have to deal with that live in front of a classroom. I have a question, and kind of like Steve, you know, I'm fairly ignorant of Soviet history and Ukrainian history. But as I was listening to you, one of the things that I was kind of thinking about, the different kind of subjects that you've looked at, migration history, Jewish history, labor history, all of these seem so sort of central to the Soviet experience. And then you were drawn, and then you sort of found yourself bumping into Ukraine or in Ukraine. In some ways, it seemed the way you were talking about it without real design. And so I was wondering a little bit if there's something about Ukraine, its relationship where it is with Eastern Europe, how it's been buffeted by empire, that makes it a region that's more central in some ways to something that would be called a general kind of Soviet history. Or if you think that this could have happened anywhere, and it was just that the particular kinds of things that you were looking at led you there. So my basic question is just a few of your reflections about what it seemed to me was one of the important points about how central Ukraine is to an understanding of Soviet history more broadly, and if where Ukraine fits kind of more broadly with other areas that are outlying in terms of the Soviet Union.
Yeah. Wow, that is a great, complicated question, Ed. I'll do my best.
My apologies for being so complicated.
That's fine. I think Ukraine is, as you say, central to those issues, but particularly as it affects or is within the context of Europe. But there's a student completing his dissertation under my supervision, whose name I saw a moment ago, Liao Zhang, who's working on the long Russian border with China, and who has found issues, that also are pretty central to the history of migration, border making, issues of even race that one could argue are no less central, albeit as far as Asia is concerned. So I think that the peculiarity, if one can put it in those terms, of Ukraine is the this historical ambiguity with Russia. So I mentioned the term in passing in my talk. For much of the late 19th and into the 20th century, the term Little Russians was used by Ukrainian intellectuals as part of their invention of the capaciousness of Russian nationality. Now, this is a term that today is highly objectionable to Ukrainians. I would say not only Ukrainian nationalists, but which had its, shall we say, utility for a good part of modern history for Ukrainians. And that that Russianness of Ukrainians, if I can put it in those terms, is, am I going to say this is unique? I think with the exception of Belarusians, okay, so there were the three Russians, right? There's the Little Russians, the so-called Great Russians, and the White Russians, Belarusians. They're all dwelling in this Russian, quote unquote, Russian space. So that's the peculiarity, I would say. But otherwise, there are different parts of the former Soviet Union. The Caucasus certainly also comes to mind that could be used to get at these central issues. Anything else? Well, if not,
hello.
Hello. Пожалуйста.
Nice to see you for the first time in my life. This live format or quasi-live. So I'm not sure whether I have a question. Maybe I haven't understand you correctly. It's you've mentioned in spoken about the deportation of the Crimean Tatars. You've mentioned ostensible collaboration with Nazis. Was it? You mean there is some data corroborating this claim, or you just were spoken about part of accusation? I mean, because what I'm asking, because it's not for the first. It was not the first deportation, and it was not for the first time. the Tatars were accused of collaboration. The same story was after the Crimean War, and I mean, it was a part of accusation back then, and now, as far as I understand, it is a part of legitimization of what Russia have done historically. There's a demographic argument and the historic one as well. So, and I'm not so much into the deportation of 54, but as far as I understand, those accusations, because they were put forward against people who were not at all under the German occupation, as the Chechens and whatever. So in some instances, there seems to be not really correct. So, and I'm asking whether there is any reliable data which would confirm that there was something like ostensible collaboration with Nazis. So,
yes, thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, well, Kirillo, I'm saying to everyone, has written about this, and I'm certainly no expert myself, but the context is, of course, that as you mentioned in the case of Chechens, many national groups were deported, either preventatively, as it were, in the case of Soviet Germans, and Finns and others, or retroactively as punishment, is in the case of the Crimean Tatars. Now, punishment for what and against whom, as far as I have read, there were individual Crimean Tatars who collaborated with the Germans, as of course there were individual Ukrainians who collaborated with the Germans and individual Russians who collaborated with the Germans. But Ukrainians and Russians were far too numerous to be deported collectively.
Yes, yes, yes.
Whereas Crimean Tatars were far less numerous. So this is part of I think the explanation for why the entire national group very efficiently, I might add, within a matter of days, was rounded up and trained and sent into the Soviet interior. Yeah, so I'm not making any claim to the degree of collaboration. I'm not going to compare percentages of people who collaborated or not. The reasons, the real reasons, may have had as much to do with the perceived lack of loyalties, irrespective of invasion and occupation. It may have had to do with the desire for resettlement of Russians and Ukrainians in that, relatively salubrious climate. So it could be a whole host of factors. Thank you for raising that. And thank you for coming, by the way, as well. Anybody else? Well, perhaps it's 1:30, is it? Yeah, 1:15. You can round it up. And,
I think so. Thanks very much, Louis. Very interesting, and it's good to see you again. I'm sorry we lost you to California, but Zoom makes it possible to reconnect.
well, in the post-pandemic era, a return visit is not without possibility. So
Okay. Great.
Thank you very much, Louis. That was great. And I'll definitely be in touch to get a tape for my students.
Great, thank you, Mark. Thanks for coming.